Welcome back to Life Science Solutions, the podcast where we break down complex challenges in product development, quality, and regulatory strategy so teams can move innovation forward with confidence. Today, we're talking about a regulatory change that has already made a ton of just splash across the news and is certainly on the radar of quality and regulatory leaders. And that's the FDA's new quality management system regulation, or as everyone on LinkedIn calls it, QMSR. To help us unpack what QMSR really means in practice, I'm joined by David Dlugo, Senior Director of Quality at Kymanox. David brings more than 30 years of experience building and leading quality system design control processes and risk management programs across pharma, medtech, and advanced manufacturing. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so really good to have you, and I'm looking forward to diving into some of the weeds of this topic. Let's start with the highest of high levels. For our I got drug friends that listen to the podcast, the legal kind of drug friends. For our non-device world friends, what's in the purview of 21 CFR Part 820?
Well, this is a really interesting regulation because it focuses on medical devices. Mm-hmm. It focuses on design control, risk management, design reviews. There's a plethora of different things that the 820 covers. And what's interesting about the QMSR, in a nutshell, it takes and harmonizes this industry standard called 1345 version 2016, which is the European standard for medical device design controls and other associated regulations, and syncs all of that together. Mm-hmm. It harmonizes all of that together and aligns it. And there's some great benefits that we'll talk about here shortly about doing this.
Yeah. It's so interesting to see that there's actually here now a kind of regulatory standard that at least EU and US, we're going to align on this ISO standard. Maybe if we have a minute, we'll dive in at the tail end. I'm curious, why don't we do this in other places of regulation? Annex 1 has been a place where even though it's an EU standard, the US has, in absolute black and white terms, said that we're going to fall in line with it. But I'm curious, why we don't do that in other places? But maybe that would make too much sense. Why did the FDA decide now is the time to do this? You mentioned the 1345 standard that we're aligning to is the 2016 version. Last time I checked, we're getting close to a decade, away from that standard. Why did we now overhaul this? Part 820 has been in place since the mid 90s. What's the problem here that we're trying to solve? Is it just global standardization, or is there something else to it?
Well, I think we need to take a step back, and you alluded to it. We are almost 20 years outside of the last big regulation change for the 820. Mm-hmm. So the FDA is actually taking the stance of saying, hey, it's time to modernize. And when we look at these international markets, wouldn't it be great to have all of our international markets starting to align together? And so they chose the path of the ISO 1345 to align with.
Yeah. So when you're talking to folks about this, what are you seeing that quality regulatory leaders, what's the dominant reaction? Are they relieved because we're going to a place of global alignment? And certainly once you get to mid and large size pharma, we're all under European and American regulation, right? Everyone's supplying into both places. And especially when you talk about product development requirements that aren't just localized to where you do your manufacturing, you're unquestionably under both. So is it relief because of global alignment, or is it anxiety because it feels like it's just one more change that they have to keep up with, and they already have all their annual reportables and everything else to just keep a product on the market?
Well, if I had to look at a crystal ball, I would say that actually both are in play.
Okay.
You have some companies that may not be strong in regulations going, oh no, I have to deal with something new, something big. Mm-hmm. And then I have another group that's like, I'm familiar with the 1345. I'm going to leverage that to some extent and apply whatever is the differences for the FDA into our new quality system. So I see a little bit of both. I think that the biggest advantage is that we're going underneath one uniform system approach.
Yeah.
One structure that we can all start now relating to for all these different international markets. Mm-hmm. And that is going to make life so much easier for a lot of those medtech, biotech companies.
Yeah, yeah. Are there holdout markets that are still going to be, we'll get into maybe some FDA specific considerations that maybe are still in place, but are there holdout markets that are still not aligned in terms of 13485? Are there still nuances
Yes,
if you look at Japan or if you look at Brazil?
Japan is a great example of regulations that are still not aligned, but they're starting to bring different components and parts together for alignment. I think the world is starting to realize it's time to align.
Yeah,
we want to be in the world marketplace. We want to make it easy for everybody.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, bring down the cost of regulation and hopefully, consequentially, the cost of the treatment itself, right? So, in this kind of landscape, is Japan considered to be the most strict from a regulatory expectation perspective? When I think to chemical compatibility for primary packaging, things like that, the JP is always the most difficult one to meet compliance to.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of more strictness in Japan than many other companies or other nations. So yes, I would agree that there are still nations out there that do feel more strong to get more data to support the safety and efficacy of these devices going into their marketplaces.
Yeah. Awesome. In terms of kind of honing into some of the practical implications, right? So, I mean, if you're explaining this to one of our clients, a VP quality, or maybe even a head of R&D or research QA, dev QA, what are some of the most important differences between the old QSR, keep my acronym soup straight here, and the new QMSR? Like, practically, what do they need to understand?
Yeah, if I had to summarize like some really major highlights, I'm going to see that the structure for the 1345 sub-clauses and clauses are going to be adopted. I'm going to see that we're no longer just relying with the FDA on the 14971 for risk-based assessments, but that risk-based assessment of processes expands to all their other elements of key processes within the quality management system. We're going to see some changes in terminology and supplier qualification. And so there's going to be a few areas that are really going to be touched by this. I mean, there's about 10 areas if I had to check that I would really be taking a close look at.
Yeah. So would you classify that, I mean, this kind of fits the paradigm that we see of just comprehensively continuing to move more and more towards genuine risk-based decision-making kind of across the board, right? We've seen more and more of that adapted into the drug space.
Yes.
At Kymanox, we would contend from the device space that's kind of led the charge in terms of that way of thinking. And I have to say, whether genuine or comprehensively, because I think it's one thing to say that you're making risk-based decisions, but you already know what your decision is going to be and you're just trying to justify it, as opposed to genuinely performing a risk assessment and letting it guide level of oversight, level of control, level of testing, right? And ultimately, you reap some benefits of doing that if you do it the right way, right?
Correct. One thing about risk-based assessments is that it starts to structure your procedures in such a way that takes the subjectivity, the human subjectivity, out of decision-making and starts putting in formal actions. And so having a ranking like high, medium, low, and then actions that are appropriate for those different rankings are really going to help a company move forward in a more efficient and effective way.
Yeah. Because ultimately, I don't know. The worst thing that the FDA can find that you're doing is that you have a procedure that tells you to do something and you're just not doing it, right? Yeah. So you're not following your own structure. But I just find that when they feel like you're playing, you're kind of slapstick happy with how you're doing things, right? And you don't have good justification, rationalization, right? Whatever it might be. They kind of feel like you're just trying to, duct tape and super glue your way past their inspection and their oversight. And that's not what anyone, I don't think anyone wants, right? I mean, certainly if your goal is to get compliant treatments on the market and do it in ultimately, the FDA doesn't want to cost you money if they don't have to, right? They want patient safety. It will cost money along the way, and that's a requirement. But the goal is to get to that place and operating in this, I would argue, the most science forward way possible is how you achieve that.
Yeah, I would totally agree that having that most scientific approach would be the best method of attacking risk-based methodology.
Or maybe as an engineer, I should say science and engineering forward approach, right? Not slight my entire my entire degree program. Is there a change under this transition to QMSR that you think teams are underestimating? Is there something you think is going to be a uh-oh or a gotcha when they have their first FDA interaction following this going into place formally in February?
Well, I'm going to go back to just our recent conversation on risk-based thinking. I think a lot of companies are underestimating the amount of risk-based assessments that you have to have throughout your quality management system. It is no longer just ISO 14971 risk management, like an FMEA or a hazard analysis. It's now expanded to CAPAs and deviations and training, and retraining. There's many different, or document changes, like do we need to send this all the way through a system? Do we need impact assessments? What does that look like? So there's a lot of actions and different types of ways that you can add risk-based rankings to take, again, that subjectivity, the human subjectivity out of your quality management system and bring really good compliant actions into your systems.
Yeah. So you mean whether my training is just read and understand, or is quiz based,
Yes.
or is OJT based, shouldn't just be on a feel good between me and QA?
That's correct.
Okay. And if you're listening to this and that just made you grimace, then maybe we should talk, because there are better ways to do that. A lot of companies kind of along that same line, a lot are asking, hey, we're already ISO 13485 certified, right? So they're patting themselves on the back because maybe they did this a couple years ago for whatever reason, right? Are they saying, hey, look, I'm basically done? I mean, how should we think about ISO certification in the context of QMSR?
Actually, that's a really good question, Chris, because what we're seeing is that there are companies that are relying on their ISO certification to get them through this. And that's not exactly what the FDA is telling industry. The FDA is saying, I'm glad that you're ISO certified, but I don't recognize that ISO certification. And so I'm going to come and audit you soon based upon the QMSR.
Yeah.
And so they're going to continue doing the supplier audits as if they were the FDA.
Correct, because they are, right?
Because they are, absolutely.
I mean, it reminds me of if you have a 9001 certification, right? Okay, so good for you. You have an independent quality system, right? Very common certification on the supplier side, right? All these people who aren't under the purview of the FDA because they don't make drugs or devices, they make input materials. All the suppliers still audit them, right? Yeah. But can you imagine, I mean, if a drug company tried to stop the FDA at the door and whoa, we got 9001, we got 1345, nothing for you to see here. Good luck, right?
Yeah, they're like, this is a piece of paper.
Yeah, good for you. I'm glad you paid that standards company some money and they spent some time. And maybe you learned something from it, right? There can be value there.
Exactly.
They can bring an independent perspective, but it's not getting you out of federal government regulatory scrutiny.
Exactly. Now, I do want to add one more thing, and that is that I do believe companies can look at that ISO 1345 cert and say, I have some confidence in my quality management system because I went through all of the stage audits to get that cert. And so there's a lot of applicability that comes from the regulation, that 1345 regulation, that's going to apply to having a successful FDA audit.
Yeah.
Now there are going to be some changes. We'll talk about that here a little bit different in a second here, but
yeah. How do you think, in terms of that 1345 experience, how do you think, especially around supplier controls and internal audits, how can that be leveraged strategically as they're looking at making sure that they're adhering to QMSR?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. Supplier audits are, you're going to need to go in and you're going to need to look at the tools that you've set up for your supplier audits and make sure that they align to the new QMSR regulations. And you're going to find that in many cases that it's going to align also with those subclauses now. That's the beauty of this harmonization, is that supplier controls, internal audits, you're going to have a lot of that starting to sync up and make it easier for the device companies.
Yeah. What are you seeing the FDA's engagement as we have some prescription here for how to handle some, supplier controls and audits and things like that. What's their level of detail that they're expecting companies to share or to at least have available to them in terms of supplier audits? Because I ask historically, we tucked those behind confidentiality, and maybe we were sometimes successful, sometimes not, in only sharing up to a certain level of detail with the agency. Because again, suppliers aren't directly in their purview. Do you think that line of argument is successful with the agency? Do you think that you need to have kind of robust documentation that goes beyond we did an audit and assessed a supplier that you're prepared to share with a regulator? Let's assume during an on-site in-person audit.
Yeah, absolutely. The 1345 brings in, not only do you qualify them, but you need to monitor them. Mm-hmm. And there's a risk-based approach to monitoring them. And so you're going to see that those supplier files are going to be living files moving forward, and that you're going to have to spend some time making sure you do your requalification and you have feedback to those suppliers, which I think is a really good practice.
Yeah. Thinking from a scope perspective, when we hear someone say QMSR applies to all manufacturers, do you think are there nuances that they're missing? I mean, what's clearly in scope, and who needs to really make sure that they take a closer look?
Yeah, so that's a really good question too, because I'm going to take you all the way back to the FDA establishment registration requirements for companies. And so what we're seeing for the QMSR, the FDA says, all of you, except for distributors and for some clinical services, are going to be subject to changes in the QMSR. Mm-hmm. So we're all going to have some bits and pieces of the QMSR affect us.
Yeah. So it's pretty comprehensive change, right? Let's say hypothetically, right? If you walked into a mid-sized device or combination product company early Q1 2026, right? And they ask, hey, what do we need to do this quarter to get ready for QMSR? How would you sequence the work, right? How would you eat that elephant?
Yeah, so Chris, we're doing that right now for a lot of companies. And so I give them my 5-finger approach or 5-step approach. Okay. And that is that, first of all, we encourage every company to read the regulations. You need to be masters of the new regulations. That's a really good practice. Don't lean on anyone. Own that regulation for your company, and then what we would suggest is that you perform a gap assessment, and we would go through a very detailed gap assessment. We would prioritize and rank the effort of changes throughout your QMS, and then the remediation comes. So then we go back and we redline, and we're going to make those changes in those SOPs and those forms, and then training happens for your staff, and then lastly, that you have to monitor your QMS for effectivity. Is it going to be effective with all these changes? And so that's the living part. So that 5th part has to be something that you have to build into your culture. Yeah.
That's a good point. And I mean, just working through the whole implementation, and really, it's one thing for the FDA to come in and find that you're not compliant with a regulation change, right? It's a different, not as bad thing for them to come in and find that you have assessed that you are not compliant with a regulation change, but you have a plan in progress right now that you're taking seriously that has reasonable durations. You can't put an 18-month CAPA in place that says get QMSR compliant and say, all right, check that box, right? They frown upon you not taking their advice seriously. So that is certainly a viable alternative, because it's going to be pretty hard pressed, if you listen to this the 3rd week of January and you decide you want to be fully compliant before the deadline, you're probably not going to do it the correct way. And they would rather you do it the correct way, right? And ding yourself internally. They don't expect you to be perfect. If they walk in and you tell them that you're perfect, now they're deeply, deeply concerned. Correct. Because you're lying. So, so I think that's a really good approach and plan for folks to leverage. Looking beyond compliance, where do you see the biggest business upside QMSR, right? So where's the business benefit here? And what's the mistake that people are already making that they're not, that is driving them to not realize this potential upside that's in front of them?
Well, the obvious is compliance. If you're not compliant, there will be consequences.
Yeah.
And so that's the obvious one. But I think from a pure business standpoint is that long term, you're gonna create with these changes an international set of efficiencies for your company in and operating in a global marketplace. I believe that right there is the number one reason why you want to do QMSR.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. So, well, David, this has been super helpful. Great, even as a historic manufacturing guy, great conversation here, all about quality. Clearly we have much more than a regulatory rewrite here with what's going on with QMSR. It goes well beyond a definition change. And it's a pretty significant shift, but it's a shift moving in the right direction that we see everything moving in this true, risk-based decision making. So thank you for breaking it down in such a kind of congruent and in a way that makes sense, and in a way that's been learned through some real world examples, right, of helping folks implement it. So yeah, really appreciate that.
You're welcome, Chris.
So to our listeners, if you're preparing for QMSR and you need some help interpreting the rule, doing beyond the reading of the reg and executing the gap analysis and even building the practical transition roadmap, as David said, we're doing it for a number of folks right now, and we're always happy to engage in chat. So thanks so much for listening to Life Science Solutions, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Life Science Solutions, presented by Kymanox and produced by WalkWest. For more insights like this, subscribe and follow Life Science Solutions wherever you get your podcast. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring what it takes to bring life science innovation to life, because patients deserve better.